donated money to them thinking that I was contributing to a good cause. That's all it was. And of course, I started getting, I can't remember, probably weekly emails from AIPAC with information that would show horrible things that the Arab world, that the Palestinians had done to Israel. They're never going to admit to anything negative that Israel does. Anything negative Israel does, they're going to justify it. So I was a member of them because it seemed like an appropriate thing for a Jew to do. What they don't say is that the partition plan gave 56% of historic Palestine, along with 80% of the coast and the most fertile land, to the Jewish side, 43% to the Palestinian side, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the remaining 1%, under the United Nations administration. And Hamas, over the years, since 1988, has made well over a dozen attempts to make peace with the Israeli side. Israel has rejected it every single time. Hamas was an inevitable outcome of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Richard Forer. Richard is the author of Breakthrough, Transforming Fear into Compassion, a new perspective on the Israel-Palestine conflict, published in 2010, and Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity, essays on the tragedy of Israel-Palestine, published in 2020. He is a former member of AIPAC and now an advocate of Palestinian rights for several years. Both his books describe the inner thought processes that lead normally decent people who ordinarily believe in justice to support indecency and injustice. Richard, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I read your book, and it's an incredible turnaround, I must say. You were born in a traditional Jewish family, and you went on to become a Palestinian rights activist now for several years. I have more specific questions, but just as a preface to our discussion, if you can give us a broad stroke of this transformation for our viewers, so that they understand where you are coming from.
Okay, well, as you say, I was born in a fairly typical Jewish family. We attended Reform synagogue, and from the time I was probably 5 years old till 14 years old, I attended both Sunday and Saturday school. And of course, I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, which is between Philadelphia and New York. So there was a large Jewish population, and there was a lot of information from New York and Philadelphia about Jewish activities. And I always recognized from the time I was very young, I always noticed that Jewish people didn't use slur words to condemn other people, like Black people, Puerto Ricans, or other people, whereas a lot of the Christian kids, some of whom were my friends, commonly use slurs. And that gave me a sense that maybe Jews are a little more or a little better than other people. Also, I was born in 1948, so I grew up, within a decade to 15 years after the Holocaust. And just about every Jewish family I knew had family members who had been killed in the Holocaust. And of course, in the 1950s, anti-Semitism was fairly common in the United States. Like, for example, Jews were not allowed to join non-Jewish country clubs. Jews were not welcome in a lot of places, and that's in the Northeast. Just imagine what it was like in the South and the Midwest of the United States. So I grew up, and another very important factor for me was when I was in elementary school, in public school, and let me point out that school prayer was not considered illegal until 1960, and I graduated from sixth grade in 1960. So up through sixth grade, we had to say the Lord's Prayer, which most people consider a Christian prayer, even though it comes from I believe, from Psalms in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. But what I really didn't like was my classes would have celebrations of Easter and Christmas, and which of course would not be allowed now. But they never had celebrations of Passover or any of the other Jewish holidays, Hanukkah, for example, which is not really a major Jewish holiday, but it coincided with Christmas. And so all that made me kind of maybe get the feeling that my society didn't really respect Jews very much. And so I grew up being very defensive about Jewish people and about later on about Israel. And after the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan and took over the West Bank and Golan Heights, um, I was very proud of what Israel had accomplished. But I always knew, in fact, I didn't just know it, I felt it, that there would never be peace in the Middle East between Israel and its neighbors. And I didn't know why, but I used to hear that when I would be at synagogue as a kid. I used to hear the men talking about that a lot. And they would often say, well, the good news is that the Arabs never agree on anything. And so the Arabs are never united. Then, of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser came along, and I think 1956, the leader of Egypt and the charismatic pan Arab leader, and he became a threat. Now, David Ben Gurion, who was the prime minister of of Israel, and Israel's first prime minister, and the leader of the Jewish agency for many years before Israel's establishment in 1948, David Ben Gurion referred to Nasser as the Hitler of the Middle East. And when you're a young kid and you have relatives who had relatives who were killed in the Holocaust, and you have relatives or friends of my parents who fought in World War II, when you hear that Nasser's the Hitler of the Middle East, just imagine what kind of images that conjures up in a young person's mind. Oh my God, the Arabs want to do to the Jews what the Nazis almost did to the Jews and partially did to the Jews. So all of that reinforced my attachment to my Jewish identity. And then years go by, and I was always defensive when people would say something negative about Israel. I would get upset, and I would deny that what they were saying was true. I would say it was Arab or Palestinian propaganda. And I had no basis for any of that, really. Then in probably the mid 90s, my identical twin brother, who's an Orthodox Jew and very, very, very anti-Palestinian, my guess is that he's a supporter of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, the two ultra-Orthodox ministers in the Netanyahu cabinet. My twin brother gave me a book that had never heard of, but it was a bestseller called From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters. And that book allegedly proved that Israel has always been in the right. It basically said there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. Arabs from various parts of the Middle East moved to Palestine, to Israel, in order to get higher paying jobs from kind Jewish landholders. And they're never, and I can't remember everything it said, but it turned out it was all garbage. And it was completely debunked, first of all, by Norman Finkelstein in the United States, but it was also debunked completely by Zionist Jewish historians in the state of Israel. They referred to it as trash, utter propaganda, worthless. But I believed it all because it became my Bible. I believed it because it gave me an argument to refute anything that anyone said that was critical of Israel. So in 2006, as some people may remember, Hezbollah conducted a cross-border raid into Israel and killed 3 Israeli soldiers and abducted 2. This was in July 2006. I was very upset about that because 3 weeks earlier, Hamas had captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit on the Israel-Gaza border. And I saw those 2 events as proof of an Arab world conspiracy to destroy the Jewish state. It became clear to me that the Arab world would not rest until they threw the Jews into the sea. I was convinced about that. And the day after Hezbollah's raid, Israel invaded Lebanon with immense force. And I was very upset, but I supported the invasion. I thought it was necessary. So a couple days go by, and I decided I was going to speak with 2 of my wisest friends, both of whom were not Jewish, and both of whom had been somewhat critical of Israel in the past. But this time I thought they would realize the severity of the situation, and they would realize that Israel really was only defending itself against anti-Semites. So I went to each of them individually and I talked to them, and both of them blamed Israel for its disproportionate use of force against the people of Lebanon, and neither of them accepted my argument. And I was devastated. And so I went home and I thought about it, and I went over each conversation trying to see, did I miss something? Did I misunderstand something? And my conclusion was no, I didn't miss anything. No, I didn't misunderstand anything. And only Jews can understand the suffering of our people. Maybe my dear friends, two of the most compassionate people I've ever met, maybe they're anti-Semites like all the other non-Jews, or most of the other non-Jews. So then a few days later, during this onslaught that Israel is conducting in Lebanon, I received a phone call, a rare phone call from a friend of mine in New Jersey who I grew up with. And he rarely calls. And I knew he had studied the subject of Israel and Palestine for many years, but he never made a big deal about it at all. He was very quiet about it. And he was fairly quiet by nature anyway. Anyway, he called to tell me that he was going to be coming out west where I was living in New Mexico at the time, and was going to visit me. And I said, that's great. And then, by the way, the Arab world wants to kill all the Jews. And I went into a 2-hour diatribe against the Arab world, and he let me go. He rarely interrupted me, and he listened to me, and it was really over 2 hours. Occasionally, he would interject a comment like, no, that's wrong, no, this is what's happening. But he rarely said anything, and he didn't argue with me. He didn't criticize me. At a certain point, he said, why don't you read books by these two Israeli professors, Baruch Kimmerling and Tanya Reinhardt, both of whom were very respected, though I had never heard of them. And I thought to myself, you know what? Maybe I should read something. Maybe there's something I don't know. The only book I'd read was Joan Peters' Trash. And yet I thought, like most of my Jewish friends today and most of Israel's supporters today, I thought I knew all there was to know. But because he gave me the space to question myself, after we hung up, I went online to Amazon and looked up books by Kimmerling and Reinhardt. And when you do that, you see other books on the same subjects. And I decided I'll go to my library and see if I can find some of these books. My stipulation was I only wrote down the names of books and the names of authors who were Jewish. I wasn't going to trust that a non-Jewish author could be honest or not anti-Semitic. This is how radical I was. So I went to the library, got a few books, came home. The next day I started reading, and maybe about a week after reading fairly uninteresting material that didn't really address my concerns that much, I started reading Norman Finkelstein's Beyond Chutzpah on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. I had never heard of Finkelstein. My friend who had directed me to Kimmerling and Reinhardt had years earlier had said that Joan Peters' book was debunked by a Jewish professor who lived in New York, but he couldn't remember the name. And he was referring to Finkelstein. And I just said, oh, well, I don't believe that. The Jewish professor must have been confused, or maybe he's a self-hating Jew. So I started reading Finkelstein's book. And what happened was I knew immediately that he was a brilliant man. And everything he said, his criticism was only directed towards Israel. There was no criticism of the Palestinian people at all, or the Arab side. And I was wondering, well, when's he going to speak out about the Arabs? But I couldn't put the book down because, number one, I'd committed myself to really studying the history as objectively as I could. And number two, I recognized in the first paragraph of the book that he was a brilliant man. Somehow I recognized that. So I kept reading. Plus, he documented all of his claims very meticulously. So his sources were organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. And so I was reading and reading and reading. And as I was reading, I would go look online for the sources that he was citing in his book. So I'd go to the papers that Amnesty International, for example, that they had written on the subject. And I would look for the quotes he had taken from them. I was hoping that I would find him taking the quotes out of context or changing a word here or there to misrepresent what the organization was saying. unfortunately, sort of, at least from that prior point of view, everything he said was impeccable. There was nothing that everything he was beyond reproach. So I continued reading, and at a certain point, I was so absorbed in what I was reading that I allowed all the emotions that were going through me. I didn't resist at all. So I was going through shock at what I was reading. Oh my God, I've supported Israel all these years. This is what Israel's doing. Oh my God. And then anger at Israel for misguiding me all my life and getting me to support the maltreatment of Palestinians. Then my anger turned in on itself, and I got angry at me for being such a dupe and being so ignorant and never checking anything out. And then shame and embarrassment arose. And then finally, a great sorrow for the Palestinian people for all that they had been through. And then I put the book down. I needed a break. And I closed my eyes, and I don't know how long my eyes were closed. But when I opened them, I felt cleansed and I felt free. It was this wonderful feeling. And then I describe it in my books. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but it is very interesting. I went through a profound spiritual awakening in which I could no longer find a Jewish identity, and in which I realized that I was as much Palestinian as Israeli or American, as much Muslim as Christian or Jew or Buddhist or Hindu or Jain or whatever, and that I had recognized my common humanity with all people. And I realized that peace must first be discovered within before it can be discovered without, because the world is not an object. The world is a psychophysical or interactive experience. We project our belief system onto the world and then prove to ourselves that we're right by looking at the evidence that we have created within the world to prove that we're right. And so in a couple sentences, I guess I can epitomize what I learned in two universal principles I discovered. I do consider them universal principles. The first is that the real enemy is not someone or something outside of us. The real enemy is the unexamined mind that unconsciously projects its suffering onto the other and then blames and scapegoats the other for its suffering. The other senior principle is that the root of suffering and conflict is the attachment to a presumed, limited, and mortal, and I repeat, mortal identity, and to the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that presumption. And the reason I emphasize mortal is because when your identity is fused with a belief in Israel, for example, it can be anything, but using this as an example. When you hear criticism of Israel, you experience it as criticism of yourself. If Israel is acting inhumane and callously indifferent to the suffering of another people, that reflects upon me. And that reflects upon who I think I am, my identity. It is a mortal threat. And this is why I always say so many people would rather send their children to war to kill or be killed than inquire into their identities. So this is why I call it a psycho-spiritual problem. That is senior to it being political, territorial, ideological, cultural, or religion. At the very root, it is psycho-spiritual in nature. And that's the gist of my thesis, I guess you could say.
I want to take a step back and go to probably maybe your childhood or childhood of the 50s and the 60s in general in the US. You write that your position so prevalent within your culture had appeared reasonable and even unassailable. They had taken shape during the impressionable years of childhood and were suffused with the common accounts of my parents, rabbis, Sunday school teachers, relatives, and friends. I was in like, I wanted to ask you, like, what were these images at, maybe dining table conversation or a Sunday school? Like, were these images of, as you said, Gamal Abdul Nasser being this pan-Arab nationalist trying to destroy Israel, or were these images of the Holocaust or the biblical myths? Like, what were these images?
Well, when you grow up and you experience some anti-Semitism, I didn't experience a lot, but I did experience some. Even my friends of mine who were Christian occasionally would make some comment, like the Jews killed Christ, something like that. Because, well, they weren't Catholic, but the Catholic Church, I think it was Pope Paul VI in the mid 60s, I think it was, determined that the Jews did not kill Christ. But, for 2,000 years, everybody thought that all the Christians believed the Jews killed Christ. Anyway, so as I say, when you grow up and you feel like you as a Jew, your identity is being disrespected because in school they're celebrating Christmas and Easter, but not the Jewish holidays. When you grow up feeling that disrespect, and you know that your families and your friends' families all experience much more severe anti-Semitism than my generation, and that we all had relatives who had either escaped or died in the Holocaust, you tend to be on alert, kind of. And I was always interested in stuff like when occasionally you would see documentaries on TV or films of Auschwitz survivors. At the time, the US Army or the Russians liberated these concentration camps. And these people looked horrible, just unbelievable, like skeletons. And then you'd see the bodies of Jews all piled up. And this is what the Christians did to the Jews. And so you'd kind of develop a little paranoia when I would experience some anti-Semitism. It would make me I would become closer to my Jewish roots because I would realize that that was my haven, kind of. That was my source. That was my place of safety among the Jewish community, where I knew that obviously Jews weren't going to be anti-Semitic and turn on me. So that's pretty much how I see it. And again, the thing about Nasser, I don't know if that many of my Jewish friends were as aware of
Mhm.
current events as I was. But there is a collective thinking, and I claim that this collective mind that is that refers to the Jewish community worldwide, you don't absorb it necessarily through language. You absorb it through feeling, through kind of like an emotional osmosis, where somehow you somehow pick up on the feelings of your seniors, of your elders, maybe little comments they make that may seem innocent, but kind of hint at something. And so all of this contributed to my worldview, and then I'll add, my twin brother graduated from college. We both graduated. Well, I never graduated. Well, he graduated in 1970. And after he graduated, he moved to Israel to live on a kibbutz. And he was not religious at the time. And the kibbutzim are not religious. At least they weren't back then. But while he was living on the kibbutz, he and a couple of his friends there started taking classes at an Orthodox yeshiva nearby. And then he eventually became a member of an ultra-Orthodox sect of Judaism. And so when he came back to the United States, I would talk to him, and I thought, well, he lived there for a few years. He knows more than me. And he would say things like, well, the only thing the Arabs respect is force, and the only way to treat them is to humiliate them. He would say things like that. And every Arab who lives and dies wants to kill every Jew who lives. Radical statements like that are very common for the Jewish people he lived around, the Orthodox Jews. You see it now in Israel in volumes with the leaders, the Orthodox leaders of Israel. The Netanyahu has always been like that. And then, of course, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and the religious rabbis who have been calling for genocide since October 7th, and some even before that. So it's a serious problem. In the case of Israel and the Jewish people, I would say it's no different than it's not a different collective mind. Every culture has their own collective mind. It's just that the Jewish culture, it's in some ways because of the history of Jewish suffering that has been written about and talked about for thousands of years, maybe it's exaggerated. And because the Zionist ideology is based on the premise that non-Jews are inherently anti-Semitic, that's what you're going to grow up. You need the state of Israel because the rest of the world is anti-Semitic and they want to kill us. They want to destroy us. They want to take our rights away from us. So
for Jews of your generation in particular, like the generation that immediately followed the Holocaust, and a lot of them went to the US, and I'm particularly thinking about Americans. What did Israel and Palestine mean for you? And I'm asking this question because when I talk to my friends now, the next generation Jews in the US, a lot of them probably are liberals and left leaning. There is a sense of um, distancing from Israel on one hand, and there is a better sense of understanding of American imperialism on the other hand. So it's not just about Zionism, but it's also understanding American imperialism in general. But I'm wondering if in the 1950s, 60s, or even in the 70s for your generation, I'm wondering what was the sense of the Middle East, Palestinian lands in particular, for Americans like you who lived those immediate years after the Holocaust?
From what I can remember, very little attention was paid, well, to the occupation. Well, the occupation started after the 1967 war, and the 1967 war, when it started, there was great anxiety in the Jewish community. Israel's being attacked by, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, but Israel quickly showed that it had more firepower than those other countries, and it won this amazing victory in 5 years. In 5 or 6 days. And a lot of the Jewish community was saying it's God's will. God would not allow the Arabs to destroy the Jews, things like that. And but and so after that, Israel occupied the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. But the idea was, well, Israel's protecting itself. Israel needs to occupy these territories as a buffer zone against the Arab neighbors. Israel is only doing this because it has to. The thought that I know now that there were some within Israel who wanted Israel to give back the West Bank and make peace, and the government refused. But at the time, it never occurred to me that this occupation was cruel, or that it was, really violent and really like apartheid, like South Africa, worse actually than South African apartheid. That did not occur to me. Even the history of Israel's battles against the Arab armies in 1948 and its destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages, that I never heard anything about that. That was not part of the discussion among the Jewish people I knew growing up. And I would bet that if anyone had mentioned that, they would have been shunned. They would have been, like, booed out of the community. So we were all unconscious, Jyothishman. That's what I would say. We were unconscious, and we reveled. Maybe we didn't revel, but we wanted to be unconscious without knowing we were unconscious. And that's the same thing I see today. The Jewish side that refuses to study, like my friends who I grew up with, they won't read a book. None of the people I know who support Israel will read a book unless it's a book by someone like Alan Dershowitz that praises Israel and defends Israel, and that if you really studied in detail, can be easily debunked as just worthless. So all of the things that Dershowitz said have all been debunked. But my point is that my Jewish friends, knowing me, knowing that I've written 2 books, won't even read my books, because they don't want to find out that they have been supporting injustice and indecency all their lives. That would shatter their self-imagery. Okay? So this is the problem. The problem is denial. And what we deny, we human beings deny, we then project onto a suitable object that we can project onto. And that's why I say the real enemy is not someone or something outside of us. The real enemy is the unexamined mind that unconsciously projects its suffering, its denial, that which it cannot face within itself, onto the other, and then blames and scapegoats the other for its own suffering.
Can you talk a little bit about your decision to donate to the AIPAC and probably becoming a member? I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
What drove you to that? What was your view of the AIPAC? And if you could like to share anything about the AIPAC in general as well.
I didn't know much about AIPAC. I just knew that they were a pro-Israel organization that had a lot of members, some of whom I knew, in my town in New Mexico, and that they were supporting Israel. And so I donated money to them, thinking that I was contributing to a good cause. That's all it was. And of course, I started getting, I can't remember, probably weekly emails from AIPAC with information that would show horrible things that the Arab world, that the Palestinians had done to Israel. They're never going to admit to anything negative that Israel does. Anything negative Israel does, they're going to justify it. So I was a member of them because it seemed like an appropriate thing for a Jew to do as part of our support for each other. That's all it was. And as soon as I realized what I had been doing all my life, as soon as I awoke from this trance of unconsciousness, I was no longer interested in AIPAC, though I kept getting their newsletters. And they actually called me and wanted me to continue giving them money. And I said, I can't give money. And I had this one conversation with one of the AIPAC employees. I said, well, I can't give any more money to AIPAC unless they advocate for peace and stop doing everything that Israel tells them to do. And the person said, well, we do everything Israel tells us to do because that's what we do. And I said, well, then the AIPAC is an agent of a foreign government, and donations should not be tax deductible. Well, that was the end of that conversation. But that is what AIPAC is. They are an agent of the state of Israel. And only because they have so much power are they allowed to be treated as a nonprofit where you can make tax deductible donations. They should be outlawed altogether, in my opinion.
I'm thinking about your chapter on the transformation. I mean, it's a chapter that readers should read. I'll encourage our viewers to read because it's loaded with very lyrical and passionate phrases and words, your personal story. And one of my reactions was this moment when I finished Manufacturing Consent. I wrote to Noam Chomsky, and he appeared on our show multiple times. I wrote to him, so we did used to exchange emails. I wrote to him that you always insist that propaganda stands on very fragile ground, and that's what power knows, and that's why they try to repeat it in a very sustained manner. But when I read Manufacturing Consent, it seemed very logical from within. The whole worldview becomes very, very, as you wrote, unassailable. So my question to you is, if you could pick up like a couple of points, like there's a whole chart of hasbara on one side, right? From the narrative of Israel always acting on self-defense with good intention, to Palestine being this empty land, to being there was no Palestinians before the Israelis went there, to all sort of narratives of the generous proposal by Barak in Camp David. You saw the whole of it very differently after this transformation that you went through. So can you give us like a couple of points, how you used to believe or read them, and how you used to read after you went through Norman Finkelstein's and others?
Well, first of all, I want to mention that I agree with Noam Chomsky that this propaganda stands on thin ground. That's one of the reasons why people become so hysterical when they're confronted with the facts, because they know they actually don't admit it. Most people I've met, they don't admit that they've never studied the history, but deep down they know they haven't studied the history. So when you confront them with a revision and a alteration of what they believe that proves that what they believe was completely wrong, they can actually become hysterical. It is a threat to their moral identity. So you mentioned the Barak peace proposal, which refers to the 2000 Camp David summit at the end of Bill Clinton's presidency. And yes, that is one of the most egregious propaganda beliefs that has infiltrated our society and the collective mind of Jewish culture, because they believe that Ehud Barak made a generous offered to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians rejected it, and they rejected it because they always reject peace, because they've rejected every other peace proposal prior to the year 2000, the Camp David summit. Well, first of all, Israel has rejected or ignored every peace proposal since 1948, since its establishment, every single one. And the 2000 Camp David is an example. So the head of Ehud Barak's negotiating team was Shlomo Ben Ami. And Shlomo Ben Ami, at the end of the failed summit, said, of the concessions offered by Israel fell far short of even modest Palestinian expectations. A couple years after that, he said, if I were a Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well. Ned Walker, who was a former ambassador to Israel, who was part of the Clinton negotiating team, said, of the ideas discussed at Camp David, there is no way the Palestinians could have accepted this thing. And Gamel Halal, who was the Egyptian-American translator for the American team, who had worked for numerous presidential administrations, said, the whole point of the summit was for Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to get together and discuss making a peace agreement. But Ehud Barak locked himself up in his room and refused to meet with Arafat except for one time, but for tea only, and on the condition that they discuss nothing of substance. And so this is the reality. And then when you look further into it, Dennis Ross, who was the head of the American negotiating team, who the Israelis said was more pro-Israeli than they were, and who I read Bill Clinton had to shut him in his room and keep him away for a while because he was so pro-Israeli. Dennis Ross, years later in his book, I can't remember the name of the book, he said that the Israeli offer was 91% of the West Bank with a 1% land swap. But the Israelis did not present a map to the Palestinians. But then when you dig deeper into that 91%, Dennis Ross did not subtract out from the 91% the buffer zones that could be 5,000 meters in width, parks, all kinds of Jewish-only roads. And according to Ron Pundak, who was the head of the Shimon Peres Center, who died a number of years ago, who was part of the Israel Oslo team, he said that the Barak offer basically came down to about an offer of 60% of the West Bank for peace, which at that time the Palestinians just could not have accepted. And it did not include a capital in Jerusalem, which would have enraged the entire Arab world. So it was impossible for the Palestinians to accept such a worthless proposal. I believe Barak was there mainly to con Arafat into signing an end of conflict agreement, and that would absolve Israel of its responsibilities under international law. So that's one example. Do you want me to give you another historical example of this propaganda?
Yeah, maybe like one more if you like.
Okay, one more. One that is very common also is the 1947 UN partition plan. I often hear the Jewish side say, well, the Jews accepted partition and the Palestinians rejected it. So there. What they're saying is the Jews accepted partition, therefore it's the Palestinians' fault there's never been peace, and it's the Palestinians' fault they are under occupation. What they don't say is that the partition plan gave 56% of historic Palestine, along with 80% of the coast and the most fertile land to the Jewish side, 43% to the Palestinian side, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the remaining 1%, under the United Nations administration. And they don't say that within a week, Israel violated partition by moving institutions and the rabbinate, the chief rabbinate, into Jerusalem. They don't say that Menachem Begin, the head of the Irgun and future prime minister, was praying that the Arab side, that the Palestinians would reject partition, because he knew that if they accepted partition, it would be much harder for Israel to make the cause to justify its expansion into the whole of Palestine. Because for at least 10 years before partition, it was clear to everybody, to the US State Department, to the Arab world, to all the Jews in Israel that David Ben Gurion, and the Jewish leadership had no intention whatsoever of honoring partition. As Chaim Weizmann said, one of the most famous of the Jewish leaders, the first president of Israel, as Chaim Weizmann said, we would be fools not to accept a state the size of a tablecloth, because once we get a piece of land that is legally ours, at least according to the United Nations, that will serve as the stepping stone to expand into the whole of Palestine, which Ben Gurion repeatedly said. He promised his political party that the partition plan was not the end of the issue, and also a Jewish state under partition would have had, depending on who you read, between a 40 and 49% Arab or Palestinian minority. And with the higher birth rate, eventually, within a few years, the Arab minority would have become a majority. So it's ridiculous to believe that Israel would have accepted such a thing. And so these people now, today, who are blaming the Palestinians for not accepting the theft of their land, just some institution taking away their land because they were badgered and blackmailed and treated badly by the Jewish side, to think that the Palestinians made a grievous error by not accepting partition is really ridiculous, especially in light of the fact that Israel isn't even satisfied with the 78% of Palestine it's controlled since 1949. So why would it be satisfied with only 56% without Jerusalem? It's another illogical, ridiculous argument that they make, but they can't come up with any real arguments because there aren't any. There really aren't any.
You visited Palestine, I think Gaza, and also Israel. If I remember correctly, you mentioned visiting in 2012, I think. And so this was,
Those were their trips. Yeah.
uh, say again?
That 2012 was one
2012,
of the
yeah. I
trips.
think so.
Yeah.
It was also the time of Operation Pillar of Defense.
Yes, we left Gaza. My delegation left Gaza just as Pillar of Defense was starting.
So could you tell us a little bit about your own personal experience in Gaza and in Israel? What did you see and what did you learn from it?
Well, Gaza, and again, this is before Pillar of Defense. This is before Protective Edge in 2014. And of course, it's before what's happening now. But almost all of the buildings in Gaza had mortar holes in them. The Gaza airport, which had at one time had been a very artistic, lovely airport, was completely destroyed. Just chunks of concrete and sand.
Sorry for this intervention. Rashid Khalidi, in his book, writes so beautifully about this artistic and cultural side of the Palestinian
Yeah.
buildings. Yeah.
Yes. We met with farmers, and the farmers we met with would tell us how they couldn't tend to their crops within about 1,000 meters of the Israel border because soldiers would shoot at them. Now, Israel had 300-meter buffer zones in depth, but bored soldiers, young soldiers, they get bored. They see a guy 1,000 yards away, 1,000 meters away. I think I'll just take a pot shot at him. So, and this is what was happening. At one point, while we were there, I didn't know that this was a common occurrence. I knew that Israel commonly flew jets over Gaza very low to create sound bombs, which was very distressing to the population, especially the children and pregnant women. But I didn't know, and I found out, that Israeli tanks and drones and helicopters would invade Gaza's space 6 times a week on average. And how I found that out is while we were there, Israeli tanks shooting randomly to scare anyone away from the area killed 13-year-old Hamid Abu Daka when he was playing soccer in front of his house in the village of Abasan Kabira, which is about a mile from the Israel border. It's a nice little village. And he was just a victim of random gunfire. So we attended, the day after the boy was killed, my delegation attended the funeral. And afterwards we went and visited his home, Hamid's family home. And then we walked back to our bus, which was maybe parked a half mile away. And there were a bunch of villagers waiting to speak with us. And one woman approached me and she said, "Do you sleep with your shoes on?" And I said, and I knew she was asking, it was really a rhetorical question. I knew that she was telling me she slept with her shoes on. So I asked her to explain, and she told me that Israel's incursions into Gaza 6 days a week are with their random gunfire to scare people away are so terrifying that people sleep with their shoes on so that when that starts happening, they can jump out of bed and run to whatever safety they can possibly find. And that is common. Imagine living like that. Imagine growing up in such conditions. It's just horrible. The water was horrible. Many people in my delegation got sick, even though they were avoiding the water. I didn't even brush my teeth with the water. I would buy, purified water and brush my teeth with that. I was a little afraid. I took showers, but I made sure to not let the water go into my ears or my eyes or my mouth. Um, People were getting very sick, and the people of Gaza were very nice. I never met so many brilliant people in such a short space of time as when I was in Gaza in every area, whether they were scientists, lawyers, whatever, worked for the UNRWA. I was very impressed with the people there, and they just want to live in peace. Please get Israel to stop the blockade so we can get food. Please get Israel to stop shooting at our farmers so we can farm more vegetables, things like that. They're human beings. And that is something that Israel does not recognize. Israel, if it wasn't obvious before October 7th, it should be obvious now that Israel does not see the Palestinian people as human beings.
I want to ask you about what you think is the way forward. Um, we have hosted a number of guests on our show, and I think with the exception of Jeffrey Sachs, and this was like we hosted Jeffrey Sachs a little bit earlier, he seemed to be a little bit optimistic, but I think I'm not sure what his positions are now, but I think with his exception, everyone we hosted, everyone has been very, very almost pessimistic or even cynical about the way forward as far as Israel-Palestine conflict is concerned. What's your view on that?
I'm also very pessimistic. Let's state what is an obvious fact by now that people should realize. Israel wants to get rid of the Palestinian people. They've always wanted to get rid of the Palestinian people, and now what happened on October 7th gave them the pretext. Okay, Biden calls himself a proud Zionist. Even the other day, just a few days ago, he repeated that if Israel didn't exist, the United States would have to create one. Even after all this genocide, okay, and whether people want to call it genocide or not, the fact remains that there are about 40,000 documented deaths. The Lancet, the respectable British medical journal, says that there's
184,
at least
184,
186,000, and
186.
that's a conservative estimate. Okay, but in any case, the Netanyahu has always wanted to get rid of the Palestinians, and he doesn't care how he gets rid of it. If the United States and the world didn't care at all, Israel would slaughter all the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. The settlers would go on an absolute rampage, okay, and then they would invade Gaza. So it's really the United States is the key, and unfortunately, as we can see from our cowardly congressmen, there's only a tiny handful that will really come out and seriously criticize Israel. Even when they criticize Israel, they'll still have to say the obligatory, I condemn Hamas. Hamas should be destroyed. Hamas was an inevitable uh, outcome of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. I know I'm veering a little off topic, but when the state of Israel rejects or ignores every peace proposal, when they violently shut down every act of civil disobedience. For example, the first Intifada was largely nonviolent. Israel killed over 200 Palestinians the first year, arrested thousands, broke people's bones, deported or imprisoned all the leaders of nonviolence, and helped and collaborated with the Muslim Brotherhood to create Hamas as a religious alternative. When you do that, when you slaughter people during the Great March of Return in 2018 who are simply picnicking, including children, and you do it with highly trained snipers using bullets that are designed to shatter knees and cause amputations, and then you don't let people leave Gaza to get advanced medical care because the hospitals in Gaza don't have the medical equipment because Israel won't let it in. What do you expect? Okay, what was Hamas's choice? So I just want to mention one thing. So think about this. Since 2002, the entire Arab Muslim world has had the Arab Peace Initiative has been on the table for Israel. It would normalize relations between Israel and every single Muslim country in the world. I believe that's 57 countries. It would provide strong security guarantees for every state in the region, Israel included, and it would create peace between Israel and the Palestinian people. It's negotiable, but it's based on the 1967 line. In other words, the Palestinians would have 22% of their land would be their state. Israel has not even looked at it. So imagine that. Look at all that's going on in the world, all the killing, all the murders, all the suffering, and all this time, Israel would have had a complete peace with Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and all these other, Saudi Arabia, all these countries, and Hamas. And Hamas, over the years, since 1988, has made well over a dozen attempts to make peace with the Israeli side. Israel has rejected it every single time. So that's why I'm negative. The Jewish people are fighting for their lives in their minds. They want to see these people dead because a dead Palestinian will not be able to raid their homes in the future. Okay, they're so paranoid. They're taught that Palestinians hate Jews. They're taught that Palestinians are not human. They don't see a human being. Many of these people, many of these soldiers, if you listen to them, even when they're looking at a child, they don't see a human being. They happily murder children. I've seen soldiers, Israeli soldiers, on YouTube bragging how they killed 20 soldiers. And they don't even have to worry that their government is going to come down on them and condemn them for making such an admission. They're not going to get in any trouble whatsoever with their government. That's how bad, that's how much it is, that's how common it is within Israel to hate Palestinians and make it a part of the culture, to see Palestinians as subhuman. So the only way that there can be any reasonable solution is if the United States changes its policy. But the evangelical Christians, the Republican Party in particular, there's no way in the world they are going to go along with this. So I don't see, even if Bernie Sanders, even if Rashid Tlaib, who's Palestinian, even if she were president, and with Cori Bush as her vice president, the two probably, well, Rashida for sure, and probably Cori Bush, the two most sane members of Congress when it comes to Palestine, Israel-Palestine. Even if they were the president and vice president, they wouldn't have a chance. Congress would not go along with them. They would be so demonized. So I don't know what the solution is. I think Israel was a mistake to begin with. I don't think a country that commits genocide towards the people under its control has a right to exist, even though I accept the fact that Israel does exist. They, in hindsight at least, they really have no right to exist. No country has a right to steal land from people, demonize the people, kill them, slaughter them, torture them, and keep them in occupation and deny them basic rights for their entire lifetime, plural, lifetimes. So I'm very negative about this.
Well, on that note of pessimism, Ritz, this was an incredible privilege to have you on, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jyotis. It was nice meeting you.
All right.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.